time. Thank you everyone who's already here for joining us. As you all know, we'll be having a discussion today about government transparency in Michigan. And this is a part of Bridge Michigan's monthly lunch break series where we host discussions about Michigan policy issues and other things brought to us by our readers. If you're not familiar with Bridge Michigan, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan news organization. And you can find our statewide coverage for free every day at bridgemi.com. I want to thank our Bridge members who are with us today and who help support our work. If you are not already a member and would like to become one, you can do so online at any time. Our membership director, Amber DeLynn, is going to drop a link into the chat for you. And I just want to remind you that our reporters cannot do their jobs without your support. So thank you so much. Now to introduce the special guests that we have joining us today. First, we have Marissa Kovach. Marissa is a policy strategist for the ACLU of Michigan with expertise in voting rights, reproductive freedom, LGBTQ+ rights, First Amendment rights, and government transparency. She joined the organization in 2008 and has also served the ACLU as a field organizer. As a policy strategist, she is responsible for advancing the ACLU state legislative agenda in Lansing. Marissa graduated from Michigan State University's James Madison College in 2008 with a BA in Political Theory and Constitutional Democracy. We are also joined today by Steve Deli. Steve is the Director of Labor Policy and Workers for Opportunity at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. In this role, he is in charge of researching, developing, and promoting labor reforms through studies, commentary, speaking, media relations, and legislative testimony. Steve also serves as a policy advisor for My Pay, My Say, and was appointed earlier this year as the first executive director of the Michigan Coalition for Open Government. Prior to his role at the Mackinac Center, Steve worked in private practice, specializing in employment and labor law, municipal law, contract law, the Freedom of Information Act, and business licensing. Steve is a graduate of Hillsdale College with a degree in political science and received his law degree from MSU College of Law. Go green, everyone. I'm now going to pass it over to Bridge Michigan Capitol reporter, Jonathan Oosting. Take it away, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine, and thanks, Steve and Marissa, for joining us today. We're at a really interesting juncture, I think, right now for government and transparency in Michigan. There's, of course, a number of bills floating around in the legislature. The House has once again passed public records access laws or legislation. Not yet law. The speaker's interested in reforming personal financial disclosure rules for elected officials. And there's a bunch of other ideas floating around. At the very least, there seems to be a recognition that we have some gaps here in Michigan. It's been about 6 years since the Center for Public Integrity gave Michigan a failing grade on a national report card for ethics and transparency laws. So Steve, let's start there. What is this state of government transparency in Michigan? How do we compare to other states? And what are some of those big gaps that still exist in Michigan law?
Certainly, and thank you for having me. Not favorably is going to be the bottom line of all of my answer. As you mentioned, it's been a number of years since that report came out. I would expect that report to be roughly the same today. And a lot of that is because of how we relate to other states. Michigan is one of 2 states where the governor's office is exempt from FOIA. It's one of 8 where the legislator's office or where the legislature itself is exempt from FOIA. And those 2 issues right away put us at the bottom of the pack. The other piece of why we do so poorly on these surveys and grades is simply there's a culture of non-transparency in Michigan. And I see it everything from your local townships or cities or villages to the state government itself, public universities. It really seems like everybody is pushing against transparency.
Marissa, the ACLU of Michigan and the Mackinac Center for Public Policy might not agree on a ton of issues in Lansing, but this, along with, I think, criminal justice reform, for instance, are a couple of areas where you guys really have found common ground. How did your 2 organizations find yourself working on government transparency issues together, and what does that effort look like?
Yeah, sure. So we love working with our uncommon partners. And so we're a nonpartisan organization. So for us, if we can find common ground to work with anyone, we'll pretty much work with anyone to advance common policy goals. And that's a place where the Mackinac Center and the ACLU, government transparency, where we have a lot of agreement. So I think it was a number of years ago, maybe 8 or so years ago, that we joined along with the Michigan Press Association into a coalition called MICOG. It's an acronym for the Michigan Coalition for Open Government. And along with some other reporters and journalists. And it's a coalition, just as the name says, that's committed to government transparency and expanding government transparency. And the issue of extending open records laws to the legislature and the governor's office was one of the first priority issues that the coalition took up. So we're thrilled to have them as partners and work together. And I think it's helped us very much get some traction and start some conversations on this issue in Lansing.
Yeah, you mentioned the Press Association's involvement. This is an area where I probably have a little bit of bias as a reporter because of course my job involves trying to pursue the truth about government, and more transparent government allows us to do that. So I put together a bunch of FOIA requests over the last year, a lot of pandemic related stuff, seeking state health department emails related to both COVID-19 and contact tracing programs. The first step I always start with is trying to tailor a request that's specific enough that you're likely to get what you're looking for, but aren't hit with a huge bill. But nonetheless, it can often take weeks or months even for state departments and local governments to respond to public records requests. And of course, those are just the ones that are actually subject to them and not exempt, like the legislature and the governor's office. So I recently requested, for instance, 1 week of emails from a government official, a single government official, 1 week of emails, and got a bill for over $600 for that. Steve, are those costs sometimes justified, or are they too often an unfair barrier for public access? In a perfect world, how much should public access to public records cost?
Sure. So it can sometimes be justified. There are requests that are so broad in scope that it does take a lot of money to process the request. That's not the common theme that I see. More often, I see these kind of overly broad charges are typically a way to scare the requester off and prevent them from actually following through and trying to get that request completed. I would be interested to see how they justified $600 for a week's worth of emails, unless that particular official was exceptionally busy. Most of the time, these costs are really related to attorney's fees review, what it should cost, the bare minimum necessary to actually produce the documents. And that's just not the case. That's the way FOIA is written. I mean, it's intended to charge you 10 cents a page, but because of loopholes, requests regularly come back for ridiculous amounts like yours.
Yeah, Marissa, you mentioned some of the public records legislation you're working on together with the Mackinac Center advocating for. There's a lot of different proposals floating around Lansing, not just that. Which can you walk us through sort of what you're tracking and where that process stands? And for public records requests specifically, why have these efforts failed so far in previous years?
Yeah, certainly. So there are a number of bills in the legislature. We're looking right now at a reintroduction in both the House and the Senate of a large package of bills that would extend FOIA to the governor's office. And it would also set up a similar FOIA system called LORA, the Legislative Open Records Act, for the legislature. And that package has been introduced in the House and the Senate so far. The House unanimously passed it, unanimously too, 110 legislators across the aisle supported it just about 2 weeks ago. And this is a package of bills that's been introduced for a couple of sessions now. It has passed the House unanimously. Now, I think this was the third or fourth session in a row and has always gotten held up in the Senate. But and that's unfortunate. We've been able to get unanimous votes on it for like quite a few years now. And I think unfortunately, maybe what's holding it up is that culture of lack of transparency that Steve talked about. And I guess if I were to opine and wonder if there's a uniqueness in Lansing and the legislature, I wonder if it's maybe very much tied to term limits. So we have a constant rotation of legislators coming in and out of Lansing, and some of them maybe not having experience in local government prior, not having experience serving in government that is under FOIA and open records laws, and that they're not familiar with it, that it's kind of a shock and it feels very unnatural or foreign to them, or they're afraid of it. I'm reminded by Senator Jeremy Moss, who is the sponsor, one of the sponsors of the bills in the Senate, and he shared that he used to be in local government, so he was familiar with FOIA. He recognized that it wasn't scary, it was a good thing, and that if you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to be afraid of. So I wonder if there is some unease in Lansing on what that looks like, and some trepidation, and maybe that is one reason why that legislation has been caught up for so many years. There are some other bills that we're looking at. We would love to see FOIA extended to law enforcement. We know that law enforcement officers have incredibly impactful roles that can sometimes that impact our safety and can sometimes lead to life or death situations, frankly, and extending their disciplinary records under FOIA is something that we're looking at. And then to the point that Steve talked about these fees and these extended timelines, FOIA needs some reform too. And we would love to see, and this is a pitch from my COG too, and the coalition I talked about, but we would love to see an independent open records committee, a commission, something that provides a pro bono appeals process that the public can access, that reporters can access, rather than the process of judicial review, which is currently in place for FOIA. Not sure that's like incredibly navigable for the average person, and it may be a cost prohibitive avenue in order to get the records that you should have a right to see. And that's a place where citizens and journalists and the public can go to appeal for high fees and denials, and the lag time that we're seeing become more and more present in the application of FOIA. So
I'd actually like to jump on something that Marissa just said on the appeals process. For those who don't know, there's basically two avenues for an appeal. You can either appeal it to the head of the public body, which usually doesn't get you anywhere because they've already made one decision, or you go to court. And that, as Marissa pointed out, that's not really a method for your average citizen to be able to do anything. And in my role, I talk to reporters all the time who say the same thing, which is basically, I know I could appeal this, but I don't have the time and the resources. I've got other priorities. And so that system really does need an overhaul. I'm really glad you brought that up.
Steve, on that front, the public records legislation that has passed the House and is before the Senate would create a separate legislative Open Records Act instead of simply applying the current law to the legislature. Why is that? And that would not, for instance, subject rejected requests to judicial review. Why is it crafted that way?
I'd be speculating if I told you I knew the answer to that. It appears to me to be similar to what Marissa had mentioned earlier, kind of a general lack of understanding about how normal FOIA works and a little bit of hands-offness towards it. That's, it's not my preferred method. I would certainly prefer that bill to contain judicial review. That said, it's much better than what we have now. And I think, to give the drafters the benefit of the doubt, I think there were probably some constitutional concerns about separation of powers. I'm generally pretty concerned about that issue myself. In this case, not so much. I think judicial review would be appropriate here, but let's get this through for the first time in a long time, and then we can worry about how to fix it, I guess is how I would phrase that.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I think Steve's exactly right. There's a speech and debate clause in our Constitution that some argue prohibits the legislature from falling under FOIA. And I think when we began seriously working on this legislation several sessions ago with a bipartisan group that included now Senator Jeremy Moss and Senator Ed McBroom, that was a point that we just had to kind of compromise on, because it was an impasse as far as, what does the law say? Does it say that the legislature can fall under FOIA? Do we need to do something separate? So this was very much in the spirit of negotiation and compromise. And I think the way that we feel about it, we support this legislation very much, but recognize, as the sponsors do, that this is the floor. This is the start. It's way better than what we have right now. The legislature hasn't been under FOIA, so let's get this, and then let's continue to improve it, and let's continue to improve FOIA as well, since there are some real underlying issues there as well, where judicial review isn't serving the real need that's out there right now.
Well, that's a good segue for sort of a more hypothetical question for you, Marissa. Let's start. If you could write a piece of legislation that would, really transform Michigan sunshine laws, improve our standing nationally, what would that look like? And have you seen anything that comes close?
I don't know if I've seen anything that comes close. I think I can take a stab at describing what we'd like to see, and then I'll kick it over to Steve, because I know he has spent a lot of time toiling around with FOIA, and I'm sure he has a very long wish list. But something that lets in as much sunshine as possible. I mean, the default should be transparency. We should not be constantly creating so many different exemptions. There certainly may be a need for there certainly is a need for some exemptions when it comes to FOIA. And as a privacy organization, the ACLU understands that there are public safety concerns, that there are concerns for, say, personal medical privacy. In the case of the legislature, one exemption that's written into the current bill is some privacy protections for constituents. And the intention there is that some constituents reach out to their legislators for social services needs. They may reach out for help securing unemployment benefits or housing, and that those are needs that should be private. There's not a lot of there shouldn't necessarily be a public interest in knowing what the details of that are. So I think where we start to kind of FOIA often falls apart is when we keep adding exemptions to it, and especially with, I think, this fear that underlies it all, that things need to be kept private rather than that default being transparency. And I think we would want something in there that balances out what those fees are, something that ties it to what is the actual cost of fulfilling FOIA requests. Something, I don't know what that, I can't ascribe a number to that, but if there's an algorithm, I'm sure Steve has imagined a fix there. I see him nodding his head. And then I would love to see that open commission that provides a resolution that is pro bono, that's free for the public, that's separate from the judiciary, that's separate from the scheme that's set up in Laura right now in the legislation that would send it to a legislative body for review. Steve, do you have any?
No, I agree with all of that. First of all, I guess mine is going to be focused on the very technical aspects, just because I've processed them on the government side, and I've sent FOIA requests myself, so I have the balance. For me, governor and legislature have to be subject to FOIA. That's a big priority. Obviously, that's in our current bill package. I think we have to give FOIA some real teeth. Right now, the schedule of fines are such that you look at, say, take MSU as an example, not to bash my alma mater. I think their FOIA office is 3 people for the entire university. that's not showing priority. So what we need to do is scale up the fines to the size of the public body so that, you know, your local township doesn't get hit with $25,000 in fees, but that may be reasonable for something like a big state university. I think those fees should escalate depending on how many times you've been held to violate FOIA in the last 365 days. And I think you need hard deadlines. Right now, the way that FOIA works is the public body gets to make an estimate, and their estimates can be whatever they think it is in good faith to fulfill your request. So you may have asked for a week's worth of emails, Jonathan, and they may have estimated it'll take them 3 weeks to get you that material. We need hard deadlines there. We need a 30-day, a 60-day, something like that, where it is a drop dead date. And if you want to extend beyond that, the public body has to go to court and ask for it. Because otherwise, I mean, we at the Mackinac Center, I think I have 8 FOIA suits active right now in the last 6 months. And all of them are related to some kind of delay like that. And it's just unacceptable. So once we give FOIA some teeth, I think we'll see that culture of trying to hide everything and give as little as possible become give as much as possible and only keep exempt what really should be exempt.
Steve, going back to you, Governor Whitmer, like other politicians before her, campaigned on a pledge of transparency. In fact, in 2018, she promised she would subject her own office to public records requests voluntarily if the legislature didn't change that law, which hasn't happened. What have you seen from the Whitmer administration in terms of transparency, and you know, where could improvements be made?
Certainly. I haven't seen much in the way of transparency, but I wouldn't associate or attribute that exclusively to Governor Whitmer's administration. It seems to be something that we've seen consistently throughout history. It's one thing to be about transparency before you're in the position, and then things happen. You know, giving Governor Whitmer the presumption of good faith, she did have the COVID crisis happen. And just recently, when discussing the Senate bill package that we've been talking about, which is now through committee, she said she wanted a legislative solution instead of doing it herself to have a longer lasting legacy. Don't get me wrong, I still think she should make her office subject to FOIA, but we now have the legislation, so that's a good opportunity to extend this. I think it's just a matter of officials not understanding FOIA, not understanding the mechanics, thinking that it's going to be used as a sword against them consistently, when it's really not about that. What it's about is the public should have access to their own records. They're the public's records, and they tell us what government is doing. And we're all entitled to that, regardless of what side of the fence you're on, who you voted for. It doesn't matter. Those records should be made available. And it's a shame that it's being viewed as a litigation weapon and not a transparency method.
Steve, we have seen a lot of talk over, I'm going to return to you again, Steve, because I know this is an issue you've looked at. We have seen a lot of transparency discussions recently because of the revelation of non-disclosure agreements. First, within the Whitmer administration, with their former health director and unemployment insurance agency director, for instance. But also, we know that the House and the Senate have entered into confidential separation agreements with a number of former employees over recent years. What do you make of those non-disclosure agreements, and you know, what I guess challenges to transparency do those pose? I think you're on mute, Steve.
I am on mute. I hit the wrong button. So I in addressing these, I will say that they do exist. It's not like these are entirely unprecedented. My concern with these comes in when there's a payout of money associated with a confidentiality clause. Without one or the other, it's kind of, I mean, it happens in labor and employment law. It's not overly common. It usually indicates there's some concern by both parties that something may not be favorable to both of them. But that's pure speculation. I'm not saying that's the case for Dr. Gordon or any of these individual agreements. I do have concerns when we see 6 figures walking out the door and we don't know why. of the public's money. And that's true for the governor's office, and that's true for the legislature as well. And I think those kind of particular confidentiality clauses, which are common in the private sector, should be looked at much more heavily in the public sector, if not outright done away with. We did see the governor waive that clause for Dr. Gordon. I think that was the right thing to do. That was a pro-transparency move, and I'm glad that's what happened. But in the future, we should really avoid having those in place in the first place, unless there is a seriously good justification for doing so. And I don't know exactly what that balance looks like, but I think it's going to be something we're talking about for a while.
Yeah. Marissa, bigger picture, taking a step back for a minute, why should the average Michigan resident, the average bridge reader today, care about FOIA laws, public record, and transparency in state government? Why is this a critical issue?
I'm glad you asked. It's because it's your government. Your elected officials, they work for you. They impact almost every single detail of your life, where, how you get from places, your health care, public safety, and we live in a democracy. You should be able to be as informed as possible, to know who is representing you, who's making these critical decisions that impact your life at the local, the state, the federal level, so that you can be as informed as possible when you make decisions and you go and vote, when you engage and you're asking for services, so that you know how to take care of yourself and your safety and your community. And I think as a result, these protective laws that we have created this culture in Michigan that operates with very little expectation of meaningful public oversight. And I think for one very large but local example is thinking about the Flint water crisis and the incredible lack of transparency that covered that entire issue, and where it took months and months in order to identify what was wrong, because information was being covered up. And we have a reporter on staff at the ACLU who was doing investigative reporting to try to determine what was happening, knowing full well that there was something wrong, not being able to get information directly from the government, having to work with a team of scientists to do independent research on water samples in Flint. And then, after so many months and over a year of, digging in and making FOIA requests and trying to find out what was going on, what became very clear was, that there was a lot of that. Once more information was disclosed, that there were a lot of Flint-related emails that revealed government actors were often operating with an attempt to preempt scrutiny about decisions that were being made, and adding disclaimers to emails that stated attorney-client privilege when no one on either end of the email was an attorney, or had subject lines like not subject to FOIA or preliminary and deliberative, to make it sound like these were correspondence that were exempt from FOIA. And then I'm seeing that, a lot of communication was sent over to the governor's office for holding, because the governor's office is exempt from FOIA. So, I think that is just one big glaring example, and maybe not an everyday example, but why there was such a critical need for the public to know what was going on. There were life and death situations happening. People's health was at stake, and the residents of Flint were able to find out what was happening at the time, and it very much because of a lack of transparency. So I think that's why this is such a critical issue for all of us living in Michigan, and why it's so important that we need to expand government transparency as much as possible.
Thanks. Steve, the Mackinac Center has used FOIA quite a bit to go after public records, and it's also sued on a number of occasions when those records weren't provided. You mentioned that judicial review isn't maybe necessarily an accessible channel for everybody, but you guys have the resources and expertise to use that route. What are some of the most revealing or perhaps egregious cases that you've had to sue over?
Well, it's never really just one case. I'll give some examples that are kind of uniform throughout. I've had a request just for routine emails, nothing in particular, that took, I think, 6 months. They charged us $200 and still didn't produce records until we sued. And that's what I see everywhere. There are common themes with almost every FOIA request I deal with. Everybody takes a 10 business day extension, so they kick out their deadline for an initial response to 15 business days. Then they ask you for a large amount of fees, and they give you a long time estimate. Then they usually miss that time estimate, or if they do hit it, they'll produce documents that are heavily redacted and improperly. And I think what those kinds of things reveal is a fundamental lack of understanding of FOIA. And it's not just small places that may have never seen a FOIA request before. These are big public institutions who should know better, and they just don't. The people they have in charge of FOIA in many cases have a middling understanding at best, and it's gotten to the point where I am now consistently suing on behalf of the Mackinac Center to try and get somebody to talk to them to say, no, this is wrong, you can't do this. Not for me, I'll get the records, I know that, but I'm hoping that the suits implement some institutional change so that other people, normal, common, citizens who don't have access to, who haven't practiced FOIA law for 5 years like I have, I want them to be able to get the records without having to come to me and say, does this look right? I want them to get it freely and quickly. So those are the kinds of cases that we've seen. Another case, we have a case right now against U of M, where a donor just wanted to know how their endowed gift was being spent. And it took over 9 months, and they still weren't able to produce these records that should have been held somewhere pretty easily accessed. So that's the kind of thing that we're dealing with. It's excessive delays, excessive fees, excessive redactions. And until there's either harsh penalties or we can get some continual lawsuits going to say, this isn't going away until you change this, it's going to stay the same until one of those two things happens.
Steve, can you maybe tell us a little bit about your recent litigation with Charlie LaDuff? He's a Detroit area reporter, and I believe you've joined with him to sue over nursing home records from the state. That's
correct. So we have 2 different COVID FOIA cases going on right now. The first is the one that you mentioned with Charlie LaDuff. He asked for data relating to aggregated data relating to December COVID deaths. Basically, a number of deaths were added to the state tally that month that had come from vital record searches, which is searching for death certificates. He wanted that information and was denied it. We don't know what that information will show because we don't have it, but we do think that we should have access to that information. So we're representing Charlie in that case. We're also suing on our own behalf because we sought out records from the University of Michigan for communications between them and the governor's office, since the governor had cited a number of professors there as being instrumental to building her COVID policy. We wanted to see what that information was. That suit's still ongoing. So we've got a few of those, but it's not just COVID and it's not just Governor Whitmer. I mean, we've shared Marissa's struggles. We had to sue Governor Snyder to get some documents related to the Flint water crisis too. So it's a common problem, and we're just hoping that some of these cases make a difference.
Yeah, a lot of talk today about FOIA. Obviously, it's a hot topic with the legislature again considering it. The House recently approving, and now it's before the Senate. But Marissa, beyond public records legislation, what are some other transparency reforms that Michigan policymakers should be considering or advancing right now?
One that comes to mind is coming directly from a question that I see from the audience from Linda McDonald, and about legislators not having to disclose financial records or And that is some legislation that's been introduced for a couple of years now. I believe most recently introduced by Representative David LeGrand out of the Grand Rapids office, but Grand Rapids area, but requiring that legislators need to have some level of transparency in what their business entanglements are and financial records, so that there's some transparency around where there may be conflicts of interest. They're voting on policies that have can have great impact on business, and they have the ability to spend quite a bit of taxpayer money, and again, just decisions that have ramifications for our lives and health. And you want to know where their motivations are and what may be compelling them to make certain votes or decisions or champion certain policy. And and to know that if it's in some cases to their personal benefit, is their interest lying with their constituents and what's for the public good and why they were elected, or are they making decisions that benefit them personally through their government job? And that's a case, I think, where, like I said earlier, if you're doing nothing wrong, you have no reason to be afraid of that level of transparency. So that's some legislation that we would like to see move along as well.
On that note, just saw a reader question pop in, and I'll just say what I know, that currently in the legislature, the House and Senate, I believe, both have conflict of interest policies, but they're very much voluntary. So in the Senate, for instance, you're supposed to sit out a vote if you might have a conflict of interest, but in practice that happens very infrequently, and there's no safeguard to ensure that happens on every occasion. Steve, same question though. What other transparency measures or policy changes do you think Michigan should be pursuing?
Well, I think Marissa hit on a great one, and I would agree with her wholeheartedly on that. The other one that immediately jumps to mind for me is just making OMA, the Open Meetings Act, a little bit easier for us. Throughout the pandemic, some of that has gone online, obviously, for health-related reasons. I think that should continue as long as the public still has the opportunity to comment, and as long as the public still has the opportunity to attend in person once the pandemic is done. There's no reason that our friends who may head down to Florida for 6 months shouldn't be able to easily keep tabs on what's going on in their home township or city. There's no reason why someone who lives in Chicago shouldn't know about the zoning decisions being made about their summer home. If we can make that access easier through something like Zoom, where they can still, appear and comment, I think that's only a good thing. That only promotes greater transparency. It allows people to see exactly what's going on, and it promotes that kind of feedback that the Open Meetings Act is supposed to have. Whether we see that or not, I don't know. That seems relatively uncontroversial to me, but that doesn't mean that it's going to go through, because lots of things seem relatively uncontroversial to me that somehow still end up not getting passed. So that's the one that jumps immediately to mind.
Great. We already sort of jumped into some of the reader questions, but I'm going to transition now to a few more of those to make sure our bridge readers get a chance to influence this discussion a little bit. So Steve and Marissa, you both repeatedly referred to a fundamental misunderstanding of FOIA among legislators and perhaps the governor as well. How should FOIA be understood? And what's so broadly misunderstood by in Lansing by folks who maybe are wary of exposing themselves to public records?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I would characterize it as a misunderstanding, more as some distrust in it, or some fear of what it is. I think legislators may recognize that it opens up their communications and the work that they do to open records and transparency. I think it may stem from that fear and that unknowing, and it may feel foreign to them because they haven't operated in an entity before, because we have so many legislators who come in new straight from politics, new into politics without experience in local government or working where they may be already used to FOIA and see that it isn't something to be afraid of. So I guess that's, I can kick it over to Steve to see if he has anything more to say on that. But I guess as far as what a fix could be is talking to your state elected official and making them know that this is something you care about, that this is a priority for you. They probably don't hear from their constituents very much about open records and transparency and the need for FOIA. And if they start getting calls from constituents and just a few constituents, it could do a lot of good in opening up their minds to it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I guess when I was speaking of a fundamental misunderstanding, I was speaking on the side of the processing of the request itself. I think the legislators, I would agree, it's more apprehension and concern than it is not understanding FOIA. On the mechanics piece, that's where I think there's a misunderstanding. And I think that comes down to training. I think FOIA coordinators should be trained. They should have time to read FOIA. There are some great free resources. Michigan State Police, I think, puts out a manual on FOIA that's rather excellent. And it's very good, especially for someone who's unfamiliar with the ins and outs. And it has a lot of the legal cases that you would need to know. There will still be times, even a well-trained FOIA coordinator will get something wrong at some point. That's how it is. Some of the rules are buried in case law that's really, really hard to find if you're not an attorney. But good training, I'd say, would resolve probably 80% of our issues. And then staffing. They just need to be better staffed, and there needs to be more of a budgetary push on that for large government entities at the least. And I think if those two things are corrected, we'll begin to see that culture change that we're desperately needing.
Steve, you mentioned the Open Meetings Act and potential reforms to that. What is the enforceability right now of the Open Meetings Act? Reader wanted to know what that looks like. What have you seen?
It's been a while since I've dealt specifically with enforcing OMA. If memory serves, the enforcement mechanisms there are a little bit lesser than even FOIA. It's essentially, if someone has violated the Open Meetings Act, they need to go back and approve whatever decision they made that they should have made properly the first time. There's some notice provisions that provide for penalties. There's not a lot you can do on that. It's usually harder to find someone who wants to bring that case. The exceptions I think you'll see are closed sessions. When somebody goes into a closed session and people think it's a controversial issue, you may be able to get lawsuits that way. I think there's some kind of fines or fees in OMA, but like I said, that's not an area that gets as much practice from a boots on the ground legal perspective as does FOIA.
Well, I think your idea about extending some of the live streaming options beyond the pandemic is a really interesting one. Obviously, local governments have invested in this technology now. They have it, so there's probably no reason to stop using it once people are allowed back in person at public meetings. Another reader question, this one came in pre-submitted. Marissa, have Michigan legislators always been exempt from FOIA? And I guess I could ask that of the governor as well. Was this something that was never addressed, or were these exemptions purposefully put in place?
Sure. My understanding is it may not have been they might not have been purposely exempt, but the courts, I think in 1968 or quite a ways back, interpreted that the way the law was written, our state constitution, that the legislature and the governor were exempt. And So this is how long that there has needed to be some proactive push and legislative fix for it, because we're one of only 2 states in the country where both the governor and the legislature is exempt from open records laws.
And we're the only one that does it by statute. We're the only one that has it written into law. Massachusetts is the other one, but that's a court decision, not a statute.
Great, thanks. Another pre-submitted reader question. Have either of you looked at application of FOIA in regards to the new Independent Redistricting Commission, and particularly whether attorney-client privilege will apply to communications involving that new board, which of course is going to be redrawing all of our statewide political boundaries for the 2022 election cycle?
I haven't looked at that specifically. That's a very interesting question, and I think that may be something that we should be looking at. In terms of attorney-client privilege, I would expect that exemption to be applied. It can be applied properly. I would expect that it's probably going to be overly broad. In theory, that exemption should be for back and forth between attorney-client for purposes of seeking legal advice or providing legal advice. I suspect what you'll see is anything with a lawyer copied on it is probably made exempt. That's a tougher exemption to overcome than most, but if you're asking if you FOIA them, will you get that exemption? I'd be very surprised if you didn't on at least some communications.
I think
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think in the particular case with the Redistricting Commission, I understand that there's currently a situation where the census data that's so needed in order for the commission to draw their lines is not going to be ready when it usually is. There's a delay, and it's not going to be available to the commission until just up before they have a constitutional deadline to provide maps. So they're in a bit of a pickle here, where they're not going to have the information they need in order to fulfill their constitutional duty. And I understand that that was the situation where there was going to be a closed session in order to meet with their attorney to figure out what the remedy was. Do they need to ask for court relief and an exemption just for this particular circumstance that hopefully won't happen again down the road? So in that particular circumstance, I think going to what Steve said, that needs to be interpreted liberally, and that there may be information that the public has a right to. I would think some of those deliberations and conversations, there is no need to shield that from the public, and that in that particular case, if your reader was asking to know specifically about what was happening there, that there's a right to know what some of those conversations were regarding that situation.
Sure, and I'll just note from personal experience, I followed a bit of the Independent Redistricting Commission's meeting on Friday, and they did actually have their staff attorney come and publicly present 2 different ideas that they might consider for what relief to ask for from the courts, because this is going to be litigated. They're going to ask courts to extend that deadline to make sure they have time to draw maps and not be extremely rushed. Yeah, well, thank you. Steve, this is another question for you, a reader follow-up to an earlier discussion. What do you think is the most troubling aspect of the Robert Gordon non-disclosure case? Was it the amount of money that was paid out, the confidentiality clause, or the secrecy around the separation agreement itself?
For me, it's the confidentiality clause. Like I said, that can be routine, but when you combine it with the other 2 factors, that's where I have concern. It'd be one thing to agree to go your separate ways and not disparage each other. That's very common, but to not be able to talk about it at all on either side, because it also bound the governor's office, that I find a little bit odd and off-putting. I'm not surprised by the secrecy around the agreement itself. These things are not usually broadcast, even in the private sector. And the amount of money, yeah, 166 grand is a lot of money. But it's, he was a high-ranking government official. He was in charge of the pandemic response. that number didn't shock me, I guess, as much as the mutual confidentiality clause did.
Gotcha. Thank you. Let's see. Marissa, you mentioned conflict of interest legislation as one other area that Michigan could certainly improve, because we have nothing right now. Where does Michigan, how does Michigan compare to other states on that front, or even the federal government?
Oh gosh, I guess I actually don't fully know. I'm willing to presume not well, but yeah, I guess I'm not sure exactly where we fall compared to other states. And Steve, do you have a sense?
Honestly, I don't. I know we have some conflict of interest laws for people who are not legislators, but they're scattered and not all that great, and they're not like the thing that we've both been wanting, which is that disclosure. And I don't know of any other states that do that, but I focus primarily in Michigan. So I'm also guessing, unfortunately.
Sure. I'll just note from some of my past reporting, I don't think it's uncommon in other states. And at the federal level, of course, even congressional candidates before they take office have to file financial disclosure reports. So they don't tell you everything you might want to know. For instance, they can list a range of income in a certain area as opposed to a specific number, but they certainly at least shed some light on financial interests of legislators. And I believe in Congress, they're also required to report stock market gains as well while in office, to sort of prevent even the appearance of, trading based on insider government information. So yeah, good. I think that just about wraps it up for reader questions. I'm seeing one more in here that I'll pluck out. I sort of have a theory here, but who's blocking this legislation in the Senate? Why hasn't it passed in previous sessions, and could that change this year? Marissa, you want to take that?
Yeah, I'll take it. It's Senator Shirkey. It's the Senate Majority Leader who, by my understanding, that we would likely have some votes to pass this in the Senate, and that he has been reluctant to allow it to move in for a vote.
Steve, any thoughts on that?
No, she has better intel than I do. That's all.
Sure. I'll again note from my reporting that some of the bill sponsors, Jeremy Moss and Ed McBroom in the Senate, a Democrat or Republican, they say Shirkey is at least willing to engage in a discussion on the bill, which was not the case under his predecessor, Arlen Meekhoff, the former Senate Majority Leader, who was just very frank, like, nope, not going to do it, not going to happen. Shirkey is at least, open to discussing the idea, but whether that means a floor vote, we don't know. How the Senate Oversight Committee did advance the legislation out of committee last week. So now we have almost a year and 9 months to see whether
we'll see what happens.
Will allow it to go up for a vote. Maybe Sunshine Week next year. We'll see.
Steve and I will do our best to do what we can to get it through the finish line this year.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, I think that's all the reader questions we're seeing. Sorry, one more here from a reader for perhaps for Marissa. You mentioned, the idea of reaching out to legislators about this issue. What should folks be communicating to their lawmakers right now about transparency in Michigan?
Sure. I think if you can call your state senator or your state House representative, and probably your state senator, the bills did pass out of the House, so you can be rest assured that your state representative voted for it, because everyone did. So your senator, reach out to your state senator, give them a call. You can leave a message or talk to someone in person and tell them that you support the FOIA LORA package and that you would like to see it passed, and tell them why government transparency is important to you. I mean, think of some way that government has affected you in some way, and communicate to them why you think it's so important that they pass this. And from the many years I've worked in Lansing, legislators don't hear from their constituents enough sometimes on some issues, and just a couple calls can make all the difference.
Great, thanks. Amber, I think that's all the questions we have that I'm seeing.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Jonathan, for moderating. Marissa and Steve, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to the Bridge readers who took part in this excellent discussion. Just a reminder that we were recording this, so it will be posted tomorrow at bridgemi.com. So you can check it out, or if any of your friends missed it and you knew they wanted to watch it, a recording will be available there. We will be resuming our monthly lunch break series in April, so keep your eye on bridgemi.com for an announcement of the topic, as well as the registration information in the coming weeks. And just a reminder that these engagement events are made possible by the generous support of Bridge members. So to become a Bridge member today, you can donate on our website, bridgemi.com. Once again, I want to thank all of you so much for participating today. I think it was an excellent discussion. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure you did too. And we look forward to talking with you all again in April. Have a great day. Bye-bye.